Okay, this morning at approximately 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the Trump administration released what they're calling the complete Epstein files. 3.5 million pages of documents, more than 2,000 videos, 180,000 images. The Justice Department held a press conference. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stood at a podium and declared mission accomplished. "We've met our legal obligations," he said. "Full transparency achieved." But here's what you need to understand before you see the headlines celebrating this release. The Justice Department reviewed over 6 million pages of documents to produce this release. 6 million pages went in, 3.5 million came out. That means 2.5 million pages are missing, gone, not released, and nobody's explaining why. Now, before you assume this is just standard victim protection or classified material, I need you to stay with me. Because what happened this morning isn't transparency. It's something much more calculated. It's narrative control. And the timing tells you everything you need to know. Let me give you context on what's actually in these files, because this isn't just about one convicted sex offender who died in prison. Jeffrey Epstein cultivated relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world: presidents, princes, tech billionaires, Hollywood directors, academic elites. His private island in the Caribbean wasn't just a vacation spot. It was, according to prosecutors, the center of an international sex trafficking operation. Epstein died in a Manhattan jail cell in August 2019, officially ruled a suicide. His partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, was convicted in 2021 and is currently serving 20 years. She maintains her innocence. But here's the crucial detail. Maxwell is the only person who's faced criminal charges related to Epstein's operation. Everyone else depicted in these files, everyone whose name appears in flight logs or visitor records or photographs, walks free. Not because there's insufficient evidence necessarily, but because the justice system has chosen, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, not to pursue charges. So when the Trump administration releases 3.5 million pages of documents this morning, the question isn't just what they're showing us, the question is what they're hiding, and why they chose today, of all days, to make this release. Let me take you back to the campaign trail, 2025. Donald Trump, running for his second non-consecutive term, repeatedly brought up Jeffrey Epstein at rallies. He amplified conspiracy theories about the files. He promised his supporters that if elected, he would expose everything the government was hiding. "They don't want you to see what's in those documents," Trump told crowds. "Powerful people, very powerful people, they're all protected. But I'll release it, all of it. You deserve to know the truth." It was a perfect campaign message, Trump positioning himself as the outsider taking on a corrupt establishment. The truth teller who would finally reveal what Washington was covering up. His supporters loved it. They chanted, "Release the files" at rallies. They created social media campaigns demanding transparency. And Trump fed that energy. He made the Epstein files a symbol of everything wrong with the system he promised to dismantle. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because once Trump won the election and returned to the White House, his tune changed completely. Suddenly, releasing the files became complicated. The Justice Department needed time to review documents. Victims had to be protected. There were legal concerns, national security implications, ongoing investigations that could be compromised. All the urgency from the campaign trail? Gone. Replaced by the kind of bureaucratic delay Trump used to mock when other people did it. In November 2025, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. The law was straightforward. The Department of Justice had until December 19, 2025, to release all federal documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. No exceptions, full transparency. Trump signed the bill. He had to. It passed with veto-proof majorities. Both Democrats and Republicans wanted these files public. But then December 19th came and went. No files released. The Justice Department claimed they needed more time to review documents. They were protecting victims, they said, making sure no ongoing investigations were compromised. Victims' advocates were furious. These are the same documents that have been sitting in DOJ files for years, they pointed out. The same documents that various courts have already reviewed. What's taking so long? And more importantly, why was Trump, who promised transparency on the campaign trail, now the one blocking release? Critics started asking uncomfortable questions. Was the delay about protecting victims, or was it about protecting powerful people, including possibly Trump himself, who had acknowledged a years-long friendship with Epstein? Trump dismissed these concerns, called them conspiracy theories, said his Justice Department was doing everything properly, but the delay continued. December turned to January, and still no files. By mid-January, congressional Democrats were threatening contempt charges. Republicans who had supported the transparency law were getting uncomfortable questions from constituents. Where are the files? Representative Ro Khanna, a Democrat who co-sponsored the legislation, issued a statement. The law required release by December 19th. It's now January. The administration is in violation of federal law. Even some Republicans started pushing, not publicly, not in ways that would anger Trump, but behind closed doors, they were telling the Justice Department, "You need to release these files. You're making us look bad." The pressure built. Media coverage intensified. Every day without release became another story about Trump's broken promise, about transparency that wasn't transparent. And then, this morning, the files dropped. 3.5 million pages, announced with a press conference, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche standing at the podium looking almost triumphant. "Today's release marks the end of a comprehensive review process," Blanche declared. "We have met our legal obligations under the Epstein Files Transparency Act." But notice what he didn't say. He didn't apologize for missing the December deadline. He didn't explain why it took 6 weeks longer than Congress mandated. He just declared victory and moved on. That's not transparency. That's damage control. Now let's talk about timing, because this is where the story gets really interesting. This morning, Trump's Justice Department released the Epstein files. Major news, right? Potentially explosive revelations about powerful people and their connections to a convicted sex trafficker. Also this morning, Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports. Economic warfare that could collapse North American trade. Gas prices skyrocketing, auto plants shutting down, the entire US-Canada relationship in crisis. Two massive stories, same day, same news cycle. Coincidence? I don't think so. Here's how media works in the digital age. Outlets have limited bandwidth for major stories. Cable news has 24 hours to fill, but attention spans are measured in hours, not days. When two huge stories break simultaneously, they compete for coverage. They dilute each other. So ask yourself, if you're the Trump administration and you're being forced to release documents that might be embarrassing or incriminating, when do you release them? You release them when the news cycle is already saturated, when there's another massive story dominating headlines, when you can bury the release under competing coverage. The Epstein files are enormous. 6 million pages reviewed, 3.5 million released. Under normal circumstances, reporters would spend weeks digging through this material, finding connections, writing investigative pieces. But these aren't normal circumstances, because half the media is focused on the Canada tariff crisis instead. That's not an accident, that's strategy. Let's talk about what's actually in these files, and more importantly, what's been removed. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, made a big point at this morning's press conference about protecting victims. All women in the Epstein files other than Ghislaine Maxwell have been obscured from videos and images, he said. That sounds reasonable, right? You don't want to re-victimize survivors by publishing their images. But here's the problem. Previous Epstein document releases have been criticized for excessive redactions that had nothing to do with victim protection. Documents that were already public record were re-released with new redactions. Names that had appeared in court filings were suddenly blacked out. Information that journalists had already reported was treated as classified. Victims' advocates complained that the Justice Department was using victim protection as an excuse to protect powerful people instead. And now we have this morning's release. 6 million pages reviewed, 3.5 million published. That means 40% of the material was withheld. Blanche claims it's all about protecting victims and preserving ongoing investigations, but he won't specify which investigations. He won't explain why documents that courts have already reviewed can't be made public. Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer put it directly at a press conference this afternoon. The DOJ needs to clearly state whether all documents related to Trump have been released. Yes or no. We need answers. Blanche's response. He took umbrage at the suggestion that the department was protecting Trump, but he didn't actually answer the question. This isn't the first time Trump has used this playbook. Let me show you the pattern. Step 1. Make a promise. Campaign Trump swears he'll release information, expose corruption, drain the swamp. Whatever plays well with the base. Step 2. Get elected. Suddenly, it's complicated. There are legal concerns, national security issues, reasons why immediate action isn't possible. Step 3. Delay as long as possible. Let public pressure build, but keep stalling. The longer you wait, the more you control when and how information comes out. Step 4. When forced to act, do it on your terms. Release information at a time that minimizes impact. Bury it under other news. Control the narrative. Step 5. Declare victory. Claim you've been transparent. Attack anyone who questions the process. We've seen this with tax returns, with security clearances for family members, with visitor logs to the White House, with records of communications with foreign leaders. The Epstein files are just the latest example. Trump promised transparency on the campaign trail, then spent months blocking release. And when Congress finally forced his hand, he released the documents on a day when the news cycle was dominated by a trade war he created. It's not transparency, it's theater. The appearance of openness while maintaining control over what people actually see and when they see it. Now, let me be clear. I can't prove that Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariffs specifically to distract from the Epstein files release. But I can show you why the timing is suspicious. The Justice Department has been preparing this release for weeks. They knew it was coming. They knew when they'd announce it. These things don't happen spontaneously. There's coordination between DOJ, the White House press office, congressional leadership. So the question becomes, did Trump make the Canada tariff threat this morning, knowing the Epstein files would also be released today? Or is it genuinely coincidence that these two massive stories broke simultaneously? Consider Trump's history of using dramatic announcements to dominate news cycles. When negative stories about Trump emerge, he often creates bigger, more dramatic stories to overshadow them. Consider also that the Canada tariff threat, as we discussed in my previous video, is most likely a bluff, an extreme threat that Trump probably won't follow through on. So if you're Trump and you know the Epstein files are dropping today, what do? You can't stop the release anymore. Congress has forced your hand, but you can make sure that release doesn't dominate the news cycle. You create a competing story, something big enough that cable news has to cover it, something controversial enough that it splits media attention. 100% tariffs on Canada, that's big enough. Here's something most coverage is missing. The Epstein files don't just implicate Republicans, they implicate Democrats too. Bill Clinton appears in the files. Flight logs show multiple trips on Epstein's private jet, photos from various events over the years. Clinton has denied any knowledge of Epstein's crimes, and he's never been charged with anything. But his name is in there. And for Democrats who pushed the Transparency Act thinking it would primarily hurt Trump, that's a problem. This creates a political bind. Democrats can't demand more transparency about Trump's connections to Epstein without also highlighting connections between Epstein and prominent Democrats. Republicans can deflect criticism by pointing to Clinton. You want to talk about Epstein? Let's talk about everyone in those files, not just Trump. It's a classic both sides muddying of the waters. And it's exactly what happens when scandals are widespread enough that no political party has clean hands. The result? Neither party pushes too hard. Democrats issue statements calling for full transparency, but they don't actually force votes or hold hearings that might expose their own members. Republicans defend Trump by attacking Democrats, rather than addressing the substance of what's in the files. And the American public? We get a release that's controlled, redacted, timed to minimize impact, and ultimately designed to protect powerful people on both sides of the aisle. That's not how accountability is supposed to work. Let me give you specific facts about what's actually in these files, because amid all the political maneuvering, there is real information here. Previous releases included flight logs showing Donald Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's private jet at least 7 times in the 1990s. These were domestic flights, not trips to Epstein's island. Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's partner, who was later convicted of sex trafficking. Trump has acknowledged knowing Epstein socially during this period, but claims they had a falling out long before Epstein's arrest. The exact timing of this falling out has never been clearly established. New revelations from today's release include email exchanges between Epstein and tech billionaire Elon Musk discussing a possible visit to Epstein's private island. Musk, who now serves as an advisor to Trump and runs the Department of Government Efficiency, has not commented. There are also text messages between Epstein and Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist. The messages reference Trump in contexts that aren't yet fully clear because much of the conversation is redacted. Here's what's important to understand. None of these connections prove criminal activity. Being in Epstein's orbit, flying on his plane, attending events where he was present, these things aren't crimes. But they do raise questions. Questions about judgment. Questions about who knew what and when. Questions about whether powerful people looked the other way because Epstein was wealthy and well-connected. And those questions matter. Now let's talk about what's not in these files, because that might be more important than what is. 6 million pages reviewed, 3.5 million released, 2.5 million pages missing. The Justice Department says they withheld documents for 3 reasons. First, to protect victim identities. Second, to preserve ongoing investigations. Third, to respect attorney-client privilege and other legal protections. That all sounds reasonable. Until you start asking specific questions. Which investigations are ongoing? The DOJ won't say. They claim revealing that information could compromise the investigations. But without knowing what's being investigated, we can't evaluate whether the withholdings are legitimate. How much material was withheld specifically to protect victims versus to protect other parties? The DOJ won't provide that breakdown. Were any documents withheld because they implicate current government officials? The DOJ says no, but they won't prove it by letting independent reviewers examine the withheld material. This is where transparency becomes theater. The administration releases millions of pages and calls it full disclosure. But the documents they're not releasing could be the most important ones, and we have no way to know. We're asked to trust that the Justice Department, which reports to the president, is making appropriate decisions about what to withhold regarding files that might implicate the president. That's not oversight. That's hoping the fox will guard the henhouse properly. Here's the depressing reality about this release. Most people won't read these files, won't dig through the documents, won't connect the dots between various revelations. They'll see the headlines. Trump administration releases Epstein files. They'll scroll past it, maybe read a summary, maybe not, and then they'll move on to the next story. This is what I call scandal fatigue. We've become so overwhelmed by continuous revelations about corruption, abuse, and misconduct among powerful people that individual scandals don't land anymore. Epstein should be the story that changes everything. A wealthy financier ran an international sex trafficking operation for decades. He cultivated relationships with presidents, princes, and billionaires. He died in federal custody under suspicious circumstances. His partner was convicted, but no one else has faced charges despite mountains of evidence about who knew what. That should be shocking. It should demand accountability. It should result in investigations, prosecutions, reforms, but it won't. Because we've seen this pattern too many times. Big revelation, public outrage, media coverage for a week or two, then nothing. No charges filed, no systemic changes. Just another scandal that gets absorbed into the background noise of corruption we've come to accept as normal. And that's exactly what powerful people are counting on. Release the information when it can't gain traction. Let it get lost in the news cycle. Wait for public attention to move on. So let's ask the hard question. Will this release actually result in any accountability? The pessimistic view, which I lean toward, is no. Here's why. Everyone depicted in these files has already been implicated by previous releases, court documents, or media investigations. The names aren't new. The photographs aren't new. The flight logs aren't new. What's new is the volume of documentation. 3.5 million pages versus the few 100,000 previously available. But volume doesn't change the fundamental calculation. For prosecutors to bring charges, they need evidence of specific crimes. Being photographed with Epstein isn't a crime. Flying on his plane isn't a crime. Attending parties he hosted isn't a crime. What's criminal is participating in or knowingly facilitating sex trafficking, and proving that requires testimony from victims, corroborating evidence, and witnesses willing to cooperate. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted because prosecutors could prove she directly recruited and groomed underage girls. They had victim testimony. They had documents showing she managed Epstein's household and controlled access to him. But everyone else? Much harder to prove direct involvement, especially when the main perpetrator is dead and his partner is serving 20 years with no incentive to cooperate further. So we'll likely see the same outcome as previous revelations. Media stories, public discussion, demands for accountability, and then nothing. No new charges, no trials. Just the files sitting in a database somewhere, occasionally referenced by researchers and journalists. Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios for how this plays out over the next few months. Scenario 1. The files fade from coverage. The Canada tariff crisis dominates headlines. The Epstein release becomes a footnote. Journalists dig through the documents and write occasional investigative pieces, but nothing gains sustained traction. By March, it's mostly forgotten except by researchers and activists. This is the most likely outcome. It's what the Trump administration is betting on. Scenario 2. Something explosive emerges from the files. A smoking gun document that directly implicates a major political figure in criminal activity. Media attention intensifies. Congress launches investigations. We get sustained coverage and possible prosecutions. This is what transparency advocates hope for. But it's unlikely because the Justice Department had 6 million pages to review. If there was a smoking gun, they probably would have withheld it under ongoing investigation protections. Scenario 3. The 2.5 million missing pages become the story. Civil liberties groups sue for their release. Courts force disclosure of at least some withheld material. What we learn from those documents shifts the narrative. This is the wild card. It depends on whether advocacy groups have the resources to fight in court and whether judges are willing to second-guess DOJ redaction decisions. My prediction? Scenario 1. The files get absorbed into the general noise. Some incremental revelations, but nothing that changes the fundamental story. Let me bring this back to the core argument. What happened this morning wasn't transparency. It was the illusion of transparency. Real transparency would have meant meeting the December 19th deadline that Congress mandated. It would have meant explaining why 6 weeks of additional delay were necessary. Real transparency would have meant an independent review of the 2.5 million withheld pages to verify that they genuinely need to be protected. Real transparency would have meant releasing these documents at a time when they could receive proper media scrutiny, not buried under a competing scandal. Real transparency would have meant Trump following through on his campaign promise to expose everything, not using the Justice Department he controls to manage what gets released and when. What we got instead is controlled disclosure. The administration releases what it can no longer withhold on terms it dictates, timed to minimize impact. They count on the public conflating large volume of documents with complete transparency. 3.5 million pages sounds impressive. It is impressive, but it's not complete if 40% of the material is still hidden, and they count on media fragmentation to prevent sustained coverage. When every outlet is chasing multiple major stories, nothing gets the deep investigation it deserves. This is how modern information control works. You don't suppress information entirely. You manage its release. You control the narrative. You ensure that even when truth comes out, it does so in ways that minimize accountability. This story isn't really about Jeffrey Epstein. He's dead. His crimes are documented. His partner is in prison. This story is about what his case reveals regarding power and accountability in America. Epstein operated for decades. He cultivated relationships with presidents, princes, scientists, and business leaders. He threw parties. He donated to universities. He flew important people on his private plane. And either all these powerful people were completely oblivious to his crimes, or some of them knew and didn't care, or some of them participated. We don't know which. That's the problem. What we do know is that Epstein's wealth and connections protected him for years. His first conviction in Florida resulted in a sweetheart plea deal that let him serve 13 months in minimum security with work release privileges. Federal prosecutors in New York only moved against him in 2019 after investigative journalism by the Miami Herald forced the issue. And even now, with millions of pages of documents released, we're not getting full accountability. We're getting managed disclosure designed to protect powerful people's reputations and the institutions that enabled Epstein for so long. That's the real scandal. Not just what Epstein did, but how the system that should have stopped him instead protected him, and how that same system continues to protect people even after his death. So here's the question I want you thinking about as this story develops. When the Trump administration releases 3.5 million pages of Epstein files but withholds 2.5 million more, are they giving us transparency? Or are they controlling what we're allowed to see? When they release those files on the same day Trump threatens economic war with Canada, is that coincidence? Or is that strategic timing designed to split media coverage? When victims' advocates say the redactions go beyond protecting survivors and into protecting powerful people, should we believe the Justice Department's denials? Or should we demand independent verification? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that determine whether we live in a system with real accountability or just the performance of accountability. Let me know in the comments, do you think this release represents genuine transparency? Or do you think it's controlled disclosure designed to protect powerful people? If this analysis helped you see past the headlines to what's actually happening, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story isn't over, and I'll be here to dig through what comes next. Thanks for watching.